All right, welcome. So in lab 8, our objectives are to identify structures in the GI tract as well as the accessory organs, and then identify enzymes secreted by the salivary gland and how that begins digestion of starch. So that part will be next week. But this week, we'll look at more the physical part of things, the process of mastication, chewing, how that helps with digestion. And then we look at the muscles that propel the food and describe the cells and the mucosa, the epithelium, the wet epithelium that lines the gut. So everything from the esophagus, the small intestines, large intestines, and explain the function of the mucosas lining those structures. So you'll be required to look at the microscopes to be able to differentiate the mucosa in different regions of the stomach. And then we look at how the stomach is physically protected from the GI juices, the gastric acidic juices, and go on to talk about the anatomical features that allows for optimal absorption in the small intestines. We look at the circular folds, the villi, and the microvilli, and the role that this plays in absorption in the process of digestion. And then we look at the pancreas, be able to identify those, describe the path of bile and pancreatic juices, the path they follow from the point of production to the duodenum, and also explain the blood flow to and from the digestive organs. So as you can see, there's a lot to learn, a lot of anatomical structures as well in the oral cavity, the pharynx, the esophagus, the stomach, the different parts of the stomach, the muscles of the stomach, and then the blood vessels, the large intestines, the small intestines, and so on. So it's a lot of anatomy to learn, but we got this. So first in this picture here, what I'm showing is the GI tract, so the oral cavity, the pharynx, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestines, the large intestines, the colon, all the way to the anus. So that's the GI tract. That's the tube through which your food goes. And then you have your accessory organs, which are your salivary glands, your gallbladder, your liver, and your pancreas. All of these accessory glands will release some form of enzyme or chemical that aids the process of digestion. So let's start with the oral cavity. So there's the hard palate. We talked about that before, and the soft palate, which ends in uvula. So this is where your mechanical digestion begins, when you chew with your teeth, of course. And then you have, of course, enzymatic digestion also starting here, enzymatic or chemical digestion. So your saliva, for the most part, is slightly alkaline. That helps the process that starts the digestion of starch or carbohydrates. And then you have the enzymatic function, which comes from your salivary enzymes that are released. Again, we'll talk about that next class. And in addition, you have your salivary gland. So it's not just the digestive part. There is also the enzyme that helps to digest carbohydrates is amylase. But there's the cleaning part of the mouth. If your mouth was really dry because, say, you had a disease called Sjögren's syndrome, you actually would have a lot of caries. And so the saliva plays a huge role. It moistens. It's also a solvent. It helps to dissolve a lot of the foods that we eat. So it also includes some immunoglobulins, so which are antibodies that help fight foreign materials, in addition to immune cells, your white blood cells that are resident in the oral cavity. So all of these have significant role to play. So there's the salivary gland is in 3 parts. There's a parotid. So the parotid is closer to your jaw, your jawbone, and towards your ear. You have the submandibular, so your mandible is your lower jaw, sub below the mandible, submandibular. And you have the sublingual, sub below the lingual, that's the tongue, salivary gland. And then the pharynx is really a conductor tube that helps to bring food down. So there's the nasopharynx, the part that is behind the nostrils. Then there's the oropharynx right behind your uvula of your throat. And then you have your laryngopharynx, which is now going towards where your larynx is. So the process of swallowing, so there's two parts. There's a voluntary part, and for that, the bolus of food that you've chewed is pushed by the tongue against the hard palate, and it moves towards the oropharynx. And at that point, it triggers the involuntary part. So the pharyngeal phase, once the food gets into the pharynx, the oropharynx, it's reached the point technically of no return, because the muscles of the pharynx contract in a way that you don't control. It's involuntary, and also your epiglottis will close, and so that ensures that food doesn't go into your windpipe. And then you have the esophageal phase, which is again involuntary completely. You have peristaltic contractions. So those are the contractions of the circular muscles of the esophagus that essentially squeeze and push the food down. So here's the wall of the GI tract. And so first anatomically, gross anatomically, so the innermost part is the mucosa. A mucosa just refers to a moist epithelium. And so if you see epithelium there, it's talking about the same thing. And then you have the underlying connective tissue, the lamina propria. And then you now have 3 layers of muscle. And so you have your muscularis mucosa. Then you have the muscularis, the inner circular layer. The myenteric plexus is between that layer and the outer longitudinal layer. So you have the inner layer is circular. That's the one that contracts to push food forward. And you also have the longitudinal, which runs, top down along the longitudinal axis. So together, they rhythmically contract, stimulated by the submucosal nerve plexus, the myenteric plexus as well, that release local chemicals, local neurotransmitters that ensure that contraction. Meaning that if the gut is detached from the brain, the medulla in the brain, the gut can still contract, because as long as these nerves, this plexus is alive. So this is what this looks like in a histological section, a transverse section. So the mucosa right there, you see it's in darker shades of blue. The reason it's a lot bluer and kind of almost purplish is because of the mucus. And then you have the submucosa, which is connective tissue. And then you have the muscularis, which is your circular layer and your longitudinal layer. Likewise, now let's get to the stomach. So in the stomach, you have you continue the mechanical breakdown as well as a chemical breakdown, but this is really where the chemical breakdown of fat begins, and as well as proteins. This proteins, you don't begin to break down proteins chemically in the saliva. It starts a lot in the acidic environment of the stomach. But so there's 3 layers of muscle again. You have the oblique layer, the innermost layer, you have the circular layer, and you have the longitudinal layer. So the stomach, there's the esophageal end, so that's the top part, which is also called the fundus. And then there is the small intestinal end, which is the pylorus. So that's at the bottom. And then you have a little curvature. So the greater curvature is at the bottom. And so because the stomach epithelium makes a lot of acid, This part is in the greater curvature is where typically acid may accumulate if you have dyspepsia and cause the pains that you would feel. And so another thing to just mention, you could also think of the fundal area. Also, you have the cardiac. Again, this is the region at the top of the stomach. So on both sides, the cardiac or the part of the part around the fundus where the esophagus connects, and the part at the pylorus where the intestines connect, you have a sphincter. A sphincter is a band of muscle that helps to seal a tube in the body. So think of it as like how you hold the air in a balloon by holding the mouth of the balloon. So that's what a sphincter is. So you have a pyloric sphincter. You also have an esophageal sphincter. So let's dig in a little bit deeper into the epithelium of the stomach. Please note, I am at this point talking about at the tissue level, almost cellular level. That's what I'm talking about now. So this fold, this gastric folds that you see, that is in the stomach. On the fold, you have these gastric pits. And a gastric pit, in a gross anatomical image of the stomach, you would not see this pit. Why? Because it's from the pits, this tiny microscopic pits, that you release mucus and you release acid. So you will not see it. You will just see the mucus covering everything. But it's from that pit. And so this is what it looks like. There are several types of cells. You have starting from the top to the bottom. So you have, again, it's epithelial cells, columnar epithelial cells that line the gastric pit. And then as you go further down, you now begin to have your mucous neck cells. As their name sounds, they secrete mucus. You also have the surface mucus cells that secrete mucus. And this mucus is alkaline or basic and helps to neutralize some of the acid that is also released from further down. And then you have the red cell here are called your parietal cells. These are the ones that secrete intrinsic factor, and more importantly, in our case here, they secrete hydrochloric acid. And next, you have your chief cells. Your chief cells make a hormone, an enzyme called pepsinogen. So pepsinogen in itself is inactive. It becomes active when it becomes pepsin. And pepsin helps to break down your proteins. So this is why I said that it's in the stomach that protein digestion starts. The acid helps to begin to tenderize the meat or the proteins you eat, the steak. And in addition, pepsin helps to break down those meats further. And then you have your G cells that are enteroendocrine cells that make gastrin. Okay. So together, this secretory part, this lower part of your gastric pit, is called the gastric gland. So it makes a lot of either hormones or enzymes or chemicals like bicarbonate that makes your mucus alkaline, that helps to reduce the caustic nature of the acid that is released in the stomach. So now let's get to the small intestine. So you have your duodenum, your ileum, your jejunum. The duodenum is the first part right out of the stomach, followed by the ileum, the jejunum, and then the ileum. So what are the functions of the small intestines? Largely, it's to absorb nutrients, and also it finishes chemical digestion. Very minimal mechanical digestion, actually, if at all, very minimal mechanical digestion occurs here. It's largely chemical. And here you also absorb your vitamins, your water, your electrolytes. So the lining of the small intestines is adapted for that. And So there are three layers of modifications that enhances that. First is you have circular folds. These are big macroscopic folds. And then on those folds, you now have epithelial cells that those epithelial cells make are arranged on what are called villi. They have, they have villi on top of them. So what are villi again? Villi are microscopic finger-like projections that further increase the surface area. And then you have the large intestines, which is largely absorptive at this point. You absorb water, you absorb the remaining electrolytes. And in addition, it plays a huge role in making some vitamins, making and synthesizing some vitamins because you have a lot of bacteria there. So the bacteria there are beneficial, they're commensals. They live there, they feed there, they do not hurt you. The only time they would hurt you is if your immunity is low. And so they do make things like vitamin K. They make also some of your B vitamins, vitamin B5. And more importantly, this is where your physical waste, your fecal matter is made and also dehydrated um, and passes out, basically. So this is a histology of the large intestines. Notice the whitish things that you see here. Those are actually goblet cells, which are cells that make mucus. And your large intestines, because it dehydrates the waste from food, it has a tendency to make your fecal matter compacted and too hard. And so it's essential to lubricate that passage. Otherwise, you would have tears all the time. So that's what this whitish non-staining things are. These are goblet cells that contain mucus that are released to the lumen. So whenever you hear the word lumen, the lumen is the inside of the tube. So some other structures, so you have the greater omentum, which is basically connective tissue that wraps around the GI tract. It's not just fat tissue, it also has endocrine functions. You release a lot of cytokines from there as well, but importantly, they also cushion the stomach and all the visceral organs. Next is the liver. So it does a lot of important things. It forms bile, it processes nutrients. So the two major areas, for example, that we store fat and carbohydrates is in the liver. And the liver is able to do that. So it processes a lot of nutrients, even your proteins, a lot of everything. In addition, it detoxifies potentially harmful agents that are absorbed by the GI tract. So the gallbladder is within the liver. It's tucked away inside the liver. It's a separate organ, but tucked away inside, but also connected physically to the livers because it's the bile duct actually bile is made from chemicals that are modified in the hepatic cells, the hepatocytes, that are transported through to the bile duct. And so it is an integral part of the liver. And one of the things that bile does is it is released through the bile duct into the small intestines together with pancreatic juice, pancreatic fluid. And what the bile does is that it acts like soap to emulsify or break down fat. Okay, so think of what a soap does. Essentially, that's what bile does when we eat fatty foods. And next here is the pancreas, which again makes pancreatic juice. We'll talk a lot more about that. But the pancreas is nested between the duodenum, and it releases its content into the duodenum together with the gallbladder. And it releases into what is called the ampulla. So think of a little ampule, the hepatopancreatic ampulla. And this is usually done as we eat. So these muscles start to contract and release this digestive fluid, the pancreatic juice, as well as the as well as the bile, into the small intestines to begin the process of further breaking down the fat and further continuing the breakdown of carbohydrates and other nutrients. But there's also the endocrine part of the pancreas. So the endocrine part is this structure here called the islet, the pancreatic islet, or the islet of Langerhans. And in there, you have a lot of different types of cells. You have your alpha cells. The alpha cells make glucagon. You have your beta cells. Your beta cells make insulin. And also there's more, but that's all you need to know. That's the endocrine pancreas. Why is it called endocrine pancreas? That is the islet. Whatever is made there goes into the blood. You can see the red arterial and the vein, the blue vein. Whatever is made from those cells is released into the blood. It does not go into the bile duct. The part that goes into the bile duct goes through what is called the pancreatic acini. And so the acini are the ones that secrete the pancreatic enzymes, like your amylase, your lipase, your proteases. So they are called exocrine glands, whereas the islet is the endocrine gland. Why are these called exocrine? The contents are released to the outside. Why outside? I thought it's into the gut. Technically, your gut is outside, technically, because it is, think about, it's your gut that lines. If you think about your skin keeps lining your face, and it lines your lips, and it lines your mouth. And so at that point, when it becomes moist, we call it the mucosa, and it continues to line all the way down to the anus. So technically, the epithelium of the or epithelial cells in general are considered exposed to the outside, directly or indirectly. And so exo, outside. So these are the acina, the pancreatic acinus or acina cells are exocrine, whereas the pancreatic islet cells, that is the alpha beta cells, are endocrine. So that is that. We will review this a lot more in class when we meet.